Welcome to AI-103 Practice Exam, Agents, Tools, and Multi-Agent Solutions. This focus set contains 25 original questions for agent definitions, tool execution, durable conversations, memory, observability, orchestration, and multi-agent solutions. Use each question to practice the design and implementation decisions you will need on exam day. Here is how this practice exam works. First, read the complete scenario and every response. Next, lock in your answer. You will have 3 silent seconds to commit, and you can pause the video whenever you need more thinking time. Then I will reveal the correct response. Finally, I will explain why it works and reinforce the exam pattern. If this practice helps, like the video and subscribe to WebLizard's Cert Lab for the next AI-103 set. Question 1. A Foundry project is connected to Application Insights. The monitoring dashboard shows operational metrics and evaluator scores for a 10% production sample, but log-based views return access denied, and a failed request cannot be expanded into model and tool spans. The workspace tables are not protected. Which remediation addresses both gaps without changing the evaluation design? A. Assign Application Insights component contributor. Replace production sampling with a scheduled test dataset, and derive tool spans from token and latency metrics in the dashboard. B. Enable distributed tracing. Leave the workspace role unchanged, and query evaluator outputs as the source for log records whenever the dashboard reports a failed production response. C. Assign Log Analytics Reader for the associated workspace and enable distributed tracing for the application, while retaining the current evaluator rule and 10% sample rate. D. Increase continuous evaluation to 100%. Use evaluator results to reconstruct the model and toolpath, and add monitoring reader on the Foundry project for the log views. Lock in your answer. Correct response. C. Assign Log Analytics Reader for the associated workspace and enable distributed tracing for the application while retaining the current evaluator rule and 10% sample rate. Why this works? Log-based views require access to the associated Log Analytics workspace. For unprotected tables, Log Analytics Reader supplies query access. Distributed tracing records flow across model calls, tools, decisions, and dependencies. Continuous evaluation is a separate sampled mechanism, so its 10% rule need not change. Exam pattern. Repair missing log views and spans without changing evaluation. Question 2. A SaaS support system must keep one governed agent role and instruction set across tenants. Each request must use that tenant's vector store without publishing a new agent version. Returning users need durable cross-session history that operators can inspect for messages, tool calls, and tool outputs. Some histories can exceed the model context window. A. Store all tenant messages and tool outputs inside the persisted agent definition, and assume every stored item is always included in model input. B. Use one named versioned agent. Define a structured input that overrides the supported file search vector store ID's value per request. Use a durable conversation and account for model input truncation. C. Create a new unversioned agent for every request. Hardcode the tenant vector store in its instructions and discard response history after each turn. D. Use only the previous response output for context and treat that value as a durable cross-session audit store containing all conversation items. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use one named versioned agent. Define a structured input that overrides the supported file search vector store ID's value per request. Use a durable conversation and account for model input truncation. Why this works? A persisted named and versioned agent holds the governed definition. Structured inputs can override documented file search vector store IDs at runtime without creating another agent version. A durable conversation stores inspectable messages, tool calls, and outputs across sessions, but the model may receive only a truncated subset when history exceeds its context size. Exam pattern: separate governed agent definition, tenant-specific tool configuration, durable runtime history, and context window behavior. Question 3. A claims process must use a visual low-code designer. It needs connectors, deterministic conditions, a human approval gate, and a Foundry agent for probabilistic reasoning in the same run. The team is selecting a durable path for a new solution and must not depend on the retiring Foundry visual workflow designer. A 2A alone, using a lightweight agent handoff as the formal business process engine for connectors and approvals. B. Model router, with routing mode used as the if/else rules engine and approval mechanism. C. Azure Logic Apps, with deterministic connectors, conditions, and approvals surrounding the Foundry agent step. D. The Foundry Visual Workflow Designer as the long-term default, without a migration plan beyond December 1st, 2026. Lock in your answer. Correct response: C. Azure Logic Apps, with deterministic connectors, conditions, and approvals surrounding the Foundry agent step. Why this works: Azure Logic Apps is the documented visual low-code choice for combining deterministic connectors, conditions, approvals, and Foundry agent reasoning. Model Router chooses underlying models rather than enforcing business rules. A2A is a lightweight handoff rather than a formal workflow, and the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer is preview and retires on December 1st, 2026. Exam pattern: choose a hybrid orchestration host for deterministic business controls plus probabilistic agent reasoning. Question 4. A Foundry agent must call one remote A2A compatible specialist endpoint for a lightweight handoff. The specialist answer must return to the calling agent, and the calling agent must retain control of the user conversation. A formal multi-step workflow is not required. A. Use an agent framework workflow solely to force a formal multi-step process for the single handoff. B. Use the Preview A2A tool to call the remote endpoint while the calling agent retains control. C. Use classic connected agents because it remains the current Foundry new name for A2A. D. Use Azure Logic Apps solely to replace the caller's control with a deterministic approval workflow. Lock in your answer. Correct response: B. Use the Preview A2A tool to call the remote endpoint while the calling agent retains control. Why this works: the Preview A2A tool supports calling a remote A2A compatible endpoint. The called agent's answer returns to the caller, which keeps control and continues handling user input. Classic connected agents is unavailable in Foundry New, while formal workflows and logic apps address different coordination needs. Exam pattern: select the current mechanism for a lightweight remote agent call with caller control. Question 5. A team is implementing a Preview A2A integration in Foundry New. The draft plan is shown. The remote endpoint is already A2A compatible, but no Foundry connection has been created for it. Visible artifact. The implementation plan has 4 ordered steps: create a Foundry project, deploy a model, configure an agent-to-agent tool, run an integration test. A. Create an authenticated, reusable A2A project connection for the remote endpoint. B. Expose the calling agent as a public A2A endpoint, even though it only needs to call the remote endpoint. C. Install the classic Connected Agents tool and bind it directly to the Foundry New agent. D. Create a retiring Foundry visual workflow so the A2A endpoint can be contacted without connection configuration. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Create an authenticated, reusable A2A project connection for the remote endpoint. Why this works. The documented A2A prerequisites include a Foundry project, model deployment, appropriate roles and SDK or REST setup, and an authenticated A2A project connection. The connection stores authentication securely and is reusable across agent versions. Outbound calling does not require exposing the caller, and classic connected agents is unavailable in Foundry New. Exam pattern. Diagnose the missing operational prerequisite and insertion point in an A2A implementation plan. Question 6. A team must currently process documents, images, video, and audio into a user-defined structured format, ingest the results into a search index, and let a Foundry agent retrieve that knowledge. In the frozen source snapshot, the Content Understanding Tool experience in the Foundry New portal is marked Coming Soon. The design cannot depend on that portal experience being available. A. Create a Foundry Azure resource for content understanding. Define the required schema or analyzer through an available experience such as Content Understanding Studio, feed the structured output into the search index, connect agent retrieval, and verify model and region support. B. Use web search as the ingestion layer because public web grounding converts private multimodal files into the required user-defined schema. C. Configure the Content Understanding tool directly in the Foundry New portal as a generally available capability. Then assume it works for every model and region. D. Fine-tune the agent's model on the files and omit the search index, because fine-tuning is the documented way to add frequently changing private knowledge. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Create a Foundry Azure resource for content understanding. Define the required schema or analyzer through an available experience such as Content Understanding Studio. Feed the structured output into the search index, connect agent retrieval, and verify model and region support. Why this works. Content Understanding is a Foundry service that can transform multimodal, unstructured content into schema-aligned output and can feed RAG indexing. The archive source marks its Foundry New portal tool experience as coming soon, while Content Understanding Studio is a complementary available experience. The downstream agent retrieval path still needs an index or retrieval service, project connection, evaluation, and model/region availability checks. Exam pattern. Design a currently implementable Content Understanding to agent retrieval path without assuming a coming soon portal tool is available. Question 7. A team must improve policy drafts before publication. The implementation must expose critique as an application-level step, apply explicit acceptance criteria, and stop safely when repeated revisions do not pass. The team must not depend on access to a model's hidden reasoning tokens or raw chain of thought. Which design should the team implement? A. Attempt to extract raw chain of thought after each draft, and publish when the extracted text sounds confident. B. Use a maker agent to draft, a checker agent to evaluate against defined criteria, and a feedback and revision loop with an iteration cap and fallback disposition. C. Let one drafting agent revise indefinitely until its own final response states that the policy is correct. D. Increase reasoning effort and treat the resulting hidden reasoning token count as approval of the draft. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use a maker agent to draft, a checker agent to evaluate against defined criteria, and a feedback and revision loop with an iteration cap and fallback disposition. Why this works. A maker-checker loop makes critique and revision explicit at the application layer. The checker applies defined acceptance criteria and returns specific feedback to the maker. An iteration cap and fallback prevent an unbounded loop. Hidden reasoning tokens are not message content, and extracting raw reasoning outside the supported reasoning summary mechanism is unsupported. Neither mechanism substitutes for checker approval. Exam pattern. Design a bounded, externally observable critique and revision mechanism for a policy drafting workload. Question 8. A production agent's monitoring data shows a latency regression. The engineering team must determine whether the delay occurs in an LLM call, a tool invocation, an agent decision, or an inter-service dependency. Which observability capability should the team implement for this diagnosis? A. A run success rate alert without any per-request execution flow data. B. Distributed tracing that captures the execution flow across the agent's components. C. A fluency evaluator that scores the readability of sampled final responses. D. A token usage chart aggregated for the selected monitoring interval. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Distributed tracing that captures the execution flow across the agent's components. Why this works. Distributed tracing captures execution flow across LLM calls, tool invocations, agent decisions, and inter-service dependencies. That span-level visibility supports bottleneck diagnosis. Evaluation, monitoring, and tracing work together but are distinct. An evaluator score, or aggregate dashboard metric, does not localize the execution stage causing the delay. Exam pattern. Select the observability mechanism that localizes latency within a multi-component agent execution path. Question 9. An organization is starting a new production solution that requires formal, code-first, multi-step orchestration among several agents. The design must avoid a dependency that is already documented for retirement. Which two decisions align with the archived Microsoft guidance? Select two answers. A. Use the Preview A to A tool by itself as the formal multi-step workflow engine. B. Treat the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer as public, preview, and retiring on December 1st, 2026, rather than as the long-term default for the new solution. C. Implement the multi-step orchestration with Microsoft Agent Framework. D. Choose the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer as a generally available production default with no migration plan. E. Build a solution with classic connected agents because that feature is available unchanged in the new Foundry Agent service. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Treat the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer as public preview and retiring on December 1st, 2026, rather than as the long-term default for the new solution. C. Implement the multi-step orchestration with Microsoft Agent Framework. Why this works. For new code-first multi-step orchestration, the archive guidance directs designs to Microsoft Agent Framework. The Foundry Visual Workflow Designer is public preview without an SLA, is not recommended for production workloads, and retires on December 1st, 2026. A2A is a preview endpoint delegation mechanism rather than a formal multi-step workflow, and Classic Connected Agents is unavailable in the new Foundry Agent service. Exam pattern. Select a durable implementation path for a new formal code-first multi-agent workflow while applying the documented lifecycle boundary. Question 10. A Microsoft Foundry Agent service agent can invoke a high-impact tool. A human approval checkpoint is already required before that action. Testing shows that the agent's assigned guardrail scans user input and final output, but has no controls for tool calls or tool responses. The team accepts the public preview status of agent guardrails and the agent-only tool call and tool response intervention points. Which change most directly closes the identified scanning gap without treating approval as the entire safety program? A. Add another final output control and assume it scans the proposed tool payload and the tool's returned content. B. Configure the agent's assigned guardrail with controls at the tool call and tool response intervention points, and retain the approval checkpoint as one layer of the broader safeguards. C. Leave the agent guardrail unchanged, because the underlying model guardrail automatically supplies any omitted tool stage controls. D. Register the agent in Foundry control plane and assume registration applies agent service guardrails to every registered agent runtime. Lock in your answer. Correct response, B. Configure the agent's assigned guardrail with controls at the tool call and tool response intervention points, and retain the approval checkpoint as one layer of the broader safeguards. Why this works. Guardrail controls are configured for specific intervention points. For Foundry agent service agents, tool call and tool response intervention points are agent-only preview capabilities and must be configured when those stages need scanning. The agent's assigned guardrail can fully override the model guardrail, so omitted agent controls cannot be assumed to come from the model. Human approval remains one checkpoint and does not replace lifecycle-wide risk discovery, protection, tracing, monitoring, and governance. Exam pattern. Repair an effective guardrail coverage gap at high-impact tool stages while preserving defense in depth. Question 11. A team is creating separate Microsoft Foundry evaluation runs to investigate 4 agent tool behaviors. Match each behavior to the evaluator that most directly measures it. Requirements. 1. The agent chose an unnecessarily expensive tool instead of the most appropriate tool. 2. The agent selected the right tool but supplied an incorrectly formatted required parameter. 3. The tool returned the needed value, but the agent ignored it in the subsequent response. 4. The tool call failed to execute because of a technical error. Available targets. A. Tool input accuracy. B. Tool call success. C. Tool output utilization. D. Tool selection. Lock in your answer. Correct response. 1. The agent chose an unnecessarily expensive tool instead of the most appropriate tool. Matches tool selection. 2. The agent selected the right tool but supplied an incorrectly formatted required parameter. Matches tool input accuracy. 3. The tool returned the needed value, but the agent ignored it in the subsequent response. Matches tool output utilization. 4. The tool call failed to execute because of a technical error. Matches tool call success. Why this works. Microsoft Foundry provides behavior-specific agent evaluators. Tool selection measures whether the chosen tool was appropriate and efficient. Tool input accuracy validates parameters. Tool output utilization measures whether returned results were interpreted and used. Tool call success measures technical execution success. Exam pattern. Select a behavior-specific evaluator for 4 distinct tool error modes. Question 12. A support agent must preserve an inspectable history of messages, tool calls, and tool outputs when a customer returns in a later session. The team accepts that durable storage does not guarantee the entire history will fit in every model request. Which conversation tracking approach should the team use? A. Create a new unversioned agent definition for every customer turn and store the turn inside that definition. B. Persist the conversation and assume every stored item will always be sent to the model without truncation. C. Use only the previous response output and assume it creates a reusable cross-session conversation inventory. D. Create and reuse a durable conversation object for the customer. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Create and reuse a durable conversation object for the customer. Why this works. A conversation is a durable object with a unique identifier that can be reused across sessions and can store messages, tool calls, tool outputs, and other items. Previous response output is an alternative way to carry context when a conversation is not used, but it is not the requested reusable conversation inventory. If stored history exceeds the model context size, only the model input is truncated. The durable conversation remains intact. Exam pattern. Choose between durable conversation state and previous response context for cross-session inspectable history. Question 13. An architecture team is extending a customer support agent, but has not selected the implementation components. The extension must ground each active case in manuals supplied by that customer. Keep account rights behind the existing application host so the model can request but cannot execute the operation, and retain learned user preferences across new sessions. Current session history is insufficient, and the team accepts a managed preview capability for the cross-session requirement. Which three components meet these constraints? Select exactly three options. A. Configure Foundry agent service memory for learned cross-session preferences, subject to its preview prerequisites. B. Configure function calling for the account update operation, with the application executing the function and returning its result. C. Configure Foundry agent service memory in place of document retrieval for the customer's uploaded manuals. D. Configure file search against the vector store that contains the applicable customer's uploaded manuals. E. Configure the durable current case conversation history as the cross-session preference store. F. Configure function calling so the model itself executes the external account update operation. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Configure Foundry agent service memory for learned cross-session preferences, subject to its preview prerequisites. B. Configure function calling for the account update operation, with the application executing the function and returning its result. D. Configure file search against the vector store that contains the applicable customer's uploaded manuals. Why this works? File search is the retrieval mechanism for uploaded or proprietary documents. Function calling exposes the operation, but the application executes the custom function and returns its result. Foundry agent service memory is the managed long-term mechanism for learned context, and as preview, it is distinct from current session conversation state and document grounding. Exam pattern. Select separate components for interaction-scoped customer document grounding, application-controlled external action execution, and managed cross-session learned preferences. You are halfway through the practice exam. Reset your attention. Keep agent definition, tool execution, conversation state, memory, observability, and orchestration boundaries clear, and verify the exact mechanism each requirement needs. Question 14. An architect must keep one named versioned agent definition, preserve current case interaction history across sessions, and select a different documented file search vector store at runtime for each customer without creating a new agent version. Which design decisions meet these requirements? Select exactly three options. A. Express the support goal, constraints, and account change behavior in the agent instructions. B. Define a required structured input with a JSON schema for the documented file search vector store IDs override. C. Assume a durable conversation guarantees that its entire history always fits in model input. D. Treat the role, conversation history, and vector store selection as fields of one unversioned runtime object. E. Use a durable conversation to store messages, tool calls, tool outputs, and other items for the current case. F. Store each customer's conversation history inside the persisted agent definition and update that definition after every turn. Lock in your answer. Correct response. A. Express the support goal, constraints, and account change behavior in the agent instructions. B. Define a required structured input with a JSON schema for the documented file search vector store IDs override. E. Use a durable conversation to store messages, tool calls, tool outputs, and other items for the current case. Why this works. Instructions define the agent's goals, constraints, and behavior within a named, versioned, persisted definition. A conversation is a separate durable object for interaction items. Structured inputs can override documented file search vector store IDs at runtime without creating a new agent version. Durable storage does not remove the model context window limit. Exam pattern: separate agent intent, interaction state, and per request tool configuration in a multi-tenant Foundry agent service design. Question 15. A team is configuring tools for a Microsoft Foundry agent service agent. Match each implementation need to the most direct toolpath in the archived catalog. Availability still must be verified for the selected model and region, and lifecycle status must be checked per individual tool. Requirements. 1. Ground answers in uploaded proprietary documents by using vector search. 2. Ground answers in an existing Azure AI search index. 3. Retrieve current public web information and return inline citations. 4. Have the agent request a custom operation that the team's application executes and returns. Available targets: A. Function calling. B. Web search. C. Azure AI search. D. File search. Lock in your answer. Correct response: 1. Ground answers in uploaded proprietary documents by using vector search, matches file search. 2. Ground answers in an existing Azure AI search index, matches Azure AI search. 3. Retrieve current public web information and return inline citations, matches web search. 4. Have the agent request a custom operation that the team's application executes and returns, matches function calling. Why this works: file search augments an agent with uploaded files or proprietary documents through vector search. Azure AI search grounds the agent with an existing Azure AI search index. Web search retrieves real-time public web information with inline citations. Function calling lets the agent request a custom function that the application executes and returns. Catalog presence does not remove per-tool lifecycle, model, or region checks. Exam pattern: map 4 data and action requirements to distinct agent tool integration paths. Question 16. A custom agent has already been onboarded to Foundry Control Plane. The Foundry project has a connected application insights resource, but the proposed monitoring configuration is shown below. Which 2 configuration changes are required before Foundry can use that custom agent's telemetry for metrics and continuous evaluation? Visible artifact: the configuration shows that the agent is onboarded. OpenTelemetry semantic conventions for generative artificial intelligence are not enabled. The telemetry destination is a separate application insights resource. Continuous evaluation is enabled with a 10% sample rate. Select 2 answers. A. Send the agent's telemetry to the same application insights instance as the Foundry project. B. Remove the sample rate because continuous evaluation always evaluates every agent response. C. Open the Preview Agent Monitoring dashboard once. Opening it automatically adds any missing instrumentation. D. Instrument the agent to comply with the OpenTelemetry semantic conventions for generative AI solutions. E. Replace continuous evaluation with scheduled evaluations because continuous evaluation cannot run on sampled responses. Lock in your answer. Correct response: A. Send the agent's telemetry to the same application insights instance as the Foundry project. D. Instrument the agent to comply with the OpenTelemetry semantic conventions for generative AI solutions. Why this works: for a custom agent, onboarding is followed by OpenTelemetry instrumentation using the generative AI semantic conventions and routing telemetry to the same application insights instance as the Foundry project. Only then can Foundry show the custom agent's metrics and support continuous evaluation. Continuous evaluation can sample agent responses. The portal metric view is preview, and opening a dashboard does not create missing instrumentation. Exam pattern: correct a custom agent monitoring configuration so telemetry reaches the project observability path. Question 17. A deployed agent has several investigation and improvement requirements. Match each requirement to the most direct Microsoft Foundry observability capability or activity. Requirements. 1. Track real-world token consumption, latency, error rate, and quality signals over time. 2. Inspect execution flow across LLM calls, tool invocations, agent decisions, and service dependencies. 3. Produce scores for response quality, safety, reliability, or agent behavior. 4. After evaluation failures exist, cluster the failures, optimize the agent, and run evaluation again. Available targets: A. Production monitoring, B. Evaluation, C. Distributed tracing, D. Error analysis and reevaluation. Lock in your answer. Correct response: 1. Track real-world token consumption, latency, error rate, and quality signals over time. Matches production monitoring. 2. Inspect execution flow across LLM calls, tool invocations, agent decisions, and service dependencies. Matches distributed tracing. 3. Produce scores for response quality, safety, reliability, or agent behavior. Matches evaluation. 4. After evaluation failures exist, cluster the failures, optimize the agent, and run evaluation again. Matches error analysis and reevaluation. Why this works. Production monitoring tracks operational and quality signals in real traffic. Distributed tracing captures execution flow for debugging and bottleneck analysis. Evaluation produces quality, safety, reliability, and behavior scores. Error analysis begins after results exist. Inspect failures, use cluster analysis, optimize the agent, and reevaluate. Exam pattern. Differentiate monitoring, tracing, evaluation, and post-result error analysis by their operational handoffs. Question 18. A chat manager coordinates a maker and a checker for infrastructure change plans. The checker applies a fixed rubric and produces actionable findings, but successive plans remain materially unchanged, even though the iteration cap has not been reached. Which message state contract implements the intended reflection behavior? A. Return the prior draft and checker score to the checker for a second pass before involving the maker. B. Archive the checker findings for fallback review while regenerating from the original task until the cap. C. Carry the iteration number and original task into a fresh maker turn, then run the same checker. D. Return the prior draft and criterion level findings to the maker, then submit the revision to the checker. Lock in your answer. Correct response: D. Return the prior draft and criterion level findings to the maker, then submit the revision to the checker. Why this works. A maker-checker reflection cycle conditions the maker's revision on both the prior output and the checker's criterion level feedback, then resubmits the revised output. Counters. Repeated checking or feedback saved only for fallback do not create that revision path. Exam pattern. Choose the state transfer contract that creates a reflection loop. Question 19. A claims agent uses the Microsoft Foundry new tool framework. Each request must be grounded in a curated policy index, may require a custom premium calculation function, and must remain available in the same durable conversation for later turns. The application, not the model, executes the custom function. Arrange the request processing steps in the required dependency order. Move all steps into the correct order, from first to last. A. Combine the user's request with the retrieved policy content to form the grounded prompt. B. Send the augmented prompt to the model so it can generate and decide whether to call the available function. C. Query the policy index or data store for content relevant to the user's request. D. Append the generated response to the same durable conversation for subsequent turns. E. Execute the custom function in the application when the model requests it, and return the function result to the conversation. Lock in your answer. Correct response. Step 1. Query the policy index or data store for content relevant to the user's request. Step 2. Combine the user's request with the retrieved policy content to form the grounded prompt. Step 3. Send the augmented prompt to the model so it can generate and decide whether to call the available function. Step 4. Execute the custom function in the application when the model requests it, and return the function result to the conversation. Step 5. Append the generated response to the same durable conversation for subsequent turns. Why this works. The RAG path first retrieves relevant content, augments the question, and sends the grounded prompt to the model. If the model selects the custom function, the application executes it and returns the result so generation can continue. The final response is then appended to the durable conversation. This uses conversation continuity, not the separate preview-managed long-term memory service. Exam pattern. Sequence a grounded agent request across RAG retrieval, model tool selection, application-side function execution, and durable conversation continuity. Question 20. A team must harden an existing Microsoft Foundry visual workflow that can trigger a high-impact business action. The team will keep it only during a planned migration before the visual workflow feature retires on December 1st, 2026. Agent guardrails and their tool call and tool response intervention points are preview. Arrange the lifecycle activities in the intended implementation order. Move all steps into the correct order, from first to last. A. Govern production operation through tracing and monitoring while executing the planned migration before retirement. B. Measure the prevalence of the identified risks so the team can prioritize controls and approval boundaries. C. Protect the workflow by configuring the effective agent guardrail at each required intervention point and placing human approval before the high-impact action. D. Discover and assess the workflow's quality, safety, and security risks, including adversarial failure modes. Lock in your answer. Correct response. Step 1. Discover and assess the workflow's quality, safety, and security risks, including adversarial failure modes. Step 2. Measure the prevalence of the identified risks so the team can prioritize controls and approval boundaries. Step 3. Protect the workflow by configuring the effective agent guardrail at each required intervention point and placing human approval before the high-impact action. Step 4. Govern production operation through tracing and monitoring, while executing the planned migration before retirement. Why this works. The responsible AI lifecycle first discovers and assesses risks, then measures their prevalence, applies protection at model and agent levels, and governs production through tracing and monitoring. The human-in-the-loop approval is one protection checkpoint, while the effective agent guardrail must cover the required intervention points. Because the visual workflow feature is preview and retires on December 1st, 2026, the production governance step includes the migration plan. Exam pattern. Order defense in-depth lifecycle work for a semi-autonomous, high-impact workflow while preserving the preview and retirement boundaries. Question 21. A Microsoft Foundry Agent Service Assistant must learn each user's stable dietary preferences from prior interactions and reuse them across sessions and devices. The requirement is not to ground answers in curated company documents or search a document uploaded only for the current interaction. Which mechanism should the team select? A. Use only the current conversation and treat it as the managed long-term memory store. B. Use Foundry Agent Service Memory and a memory store for persistent learned user context. C. Use a Foundry IQ knowledge base as the store for learned personal preferences. D. Use file search to retain every preference after the current document interaction ends. Lock in your answer. Correct response. B. Use Foundry Agent Service Memory and a memory store for persistent learned user context. Why this works. Foundry Agent Service Memory is the managed long-term mechanism for learned user or agent context that persists across interactions. It and the Memory Store API are preview. A Foundry IQ knowledge base is for curated organizational grounding. File search is for user-provided documents during an interaction, and current conversation context is short-term rather than the managed memory feature. Exam pattern. Select the correct persistence mechanism for learned user-specific context across sessions and devices. Question 22. A team is selecting an implementation for the following new production orchestration. The orchestrator itself must be deployed as a Foundry-hosted agent. Which implementation meets the requirements? Visible artifact. The orchestration requirements specify code-first authoring. The deployment runtime is a Foundry-hosted agent. The flow is a formal multi-step process. The participants are a planner-hosted agent and a reviewer-hosted agent. The workload is a new production solution. A. Define the multi-step orchestration as a code-defined Azure Logic Apps workflow that calls the hosted planner and reviewer as steps. B. Implement the multi-step flow in hosted agent code with classic connected agents as the coordination mechanism. C. Implement an agent framework workflow from code and deploy the workflow as a Foundry-hosted agent. D. Chain A2A endpoint calls in hosted agent code and use those lightweight handoffs as the formal workflow runtime. Lock in your answer. Correct response, C. Implement an agent framework workflow from code and deploy the workflow as a Foundry-hosted agent. Why this works. Hosted agents are not supported in the Foundry Visual Workflow Designer. That designer is preview and retires on December 1st, 2026, and Microsoft directs new workflow development to Microsoft Agent Framework. Agent Framework is a supported code-first path for formal multi-step orchestration. Classic Connected Agents is unavailable in Foundry New, while a preview A2A call is a lightweight endpoint handoff rather than a formal multi-step workflow. Exam pattern. Select the current code-first formal workflow mechanism whose orchestrator can itself run as a Foundry-hosted agent. Question 23. An application uses a GPT 5.6 reasoning model deployment through the Responses API. Evaluation shows that complex cases need more processing depth, and the team also needs an explicit output token limit. Which tuning approach is supported by the packet evidence? A. Request raw hidden reasoning with a prompt and use that text as the tuning control. B. Change temperature and top P together, then add their token limits to calculate total context. C. Lower temperature, set max tokens, and assume the same behavior across reasoning model versions. D. Increase reasoning effort, set max output tokens, and validate the change behavior on the target cases. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Increase reasoning effort, set max output tokens, and validate the changed behavior on the target cases. Why this works. For the named reasoning model and Responses API surface, reasoning effort is the processing depth control, and max output tokens is the API-specific output limit. Reasoning models list temperature, top P, and max tokens as unsupported. Prompt changes and parameter changes still require validation on the target scenarios because behavior does not automatically generalize. Exam pattern. Configure supported depth and output controls for a named reasoning model on the Responses API. Question 24. A Foundry Agent Service Agent uses a model deployment whose guardrail scans user input and output at a high threshold. The agent has its own lower threshold guardrail for user input and output, with no controls for tool calls or tool responses. Unsafe tool payloads are passing through. Which change directly addresses the gap? A. Register the agent in Foundry control plane and rely on registration to scan all tool payloads. B. Raise only the underlying model guardrail because the agent automatically inherits every model intervention point. C. Add a human approval step and leave both tool intervention points unconfigured on the agent. D. Configure the effective agent guardrail with controls at the preview tool call and tool response intervention points. Lock in your answer. Correct response, D. Configure the effective agent guardrail with controls at the preview tool call and tool response intervention points. Why this works. The agent's assigned guardrail can fully override the underlying model guardrail. Tool call and tool response controls are separate, agent-only preview intervention points, so they must be configured on the effective agent guardrail when those payloads require scanning. Model-only settings, a human approval checkpoint, or control plane registration do not establish tool stage scanning. Exam pattern. Diagnose why unsafe tool payloads bypass controls when an agent guardrail overrides the model guardrail. Question 25. A team has an existing Azure AI search index and must ground a Microsoft Foundry agent service agent in that index. The index exists, but the agent retrieves no content. The team has permission to manage project connections. What should the team do? A. Leave the index unconnected, because index creation alone makes it available to every agent in the project. B. Select the Coming Soon Content Understanding tool in the new portal, and use it as the current search index connection. C. Treat catalog visibility as runtime support, and skip authentication, configuration inputs, and dependent service checks. D. Create the required project connection, configure Azure AI Search as the agent retrieval tool, and test retrieval quality and citations. Lock in your answer. Correct response. D. Create the required project connection, configure Azure AI Search as the agent retrieval tool, and test retrieval quality and citations. Why this works. Azure AI Search is a listed agent tool for grounding from an existing index. Agent retrieval requires connecting the Foundry project to the index or retrieval service, configuring the tool and its connection, and evaluating retrieval quality, response accuracy, and citations. An index alone is not integrated. Catalog visibility also does not establish authentication, dependent service access, model support, or regional support. And the Archive New Portal Content Understanding tool experience is marked Coming Soon. Exam pattern. Complete an agent knowledge integration when an existing Azure AI search index has not been connected to the agent. You completed AI-103 practice exam, agents, tools, and multi-agent solutions. Review the mechanisms you missed, revisit the official documentation where needed, and use the next set to strengthen your exam-ready judgment. Thank you for practicing with WebLizard CertLab. Continue with AI-103 practice exam, computer vision solutions.